Good morning, seniors. Today we're starting Chapter 8. This is going to be our last chapter in Unit 4, and then we'll move on to banking and monetary and fiscal policy. So let's go ahead and start this chapter. A good bit of the information is either something you've probably been exposed to over the 17 to 18 years of your life. Those of you who work, some of this may sound familiar to you, and a good bit of it too you covered in your U.S. history classes. So let's look at section 1. You probably remember from U.S. history that the labor union movement really got going during the Industrial Revolution with the terrible working conditions that were faced by men, women, and children. That was a good motivation for workers to come together to be able to get the employer to look at changing conditions, changing their hours, changing the age at which you can work, what kind of jobs and safety was involved. So the union movement really got going during this time period. So if we look at the earliest unions in the United States, what we see is that the New York City printers were the first to organize, and that began very early in 1778. There are two major types of unions you'll find in the United States. One is a craft union, also known as a trade union, and the other one is an industrial union. The difference between the two, if you belong to a craft union, the people within that union are all going to have the same skill set that you have. So the teachers union for our district, that would be a craft union because it is made up of teachers. An industrial union would be if we were to take all the workers that go into the same industry, not consider their jobs. That's what an industrial union would be. So for example, at the time, a lot of the unions, the industrial unions that started were in the textile industry and also the steel industry. There weren't a lot of very separate jobs that were skilled that formed craft unions. Instead, it tended to be a lot of unskilled workers with all different jobs related to the development of textiles or cloth, or the development and the production of steel. So the industrial unions were pretty much anybody who worked in the textile industry came together and formed this union, whether or not they worked weaving, or if they were dyeing, or they were maintenance on the machine. They all came together in the industrial unions. So the craft union were skilled workers, whereas the industrial unions really started with a lot of unskilled workers. Most of you are familiar with these ideas, the different activities that unions can engage in order to try to get their way or negotiate with their employer. The first of these activities is a strike, where the employee decides not to work. And then one-upping that would be for the strike to also move into a picket, where those workers who are striking carry signs outside of the business to try to make more public either what's going on at the business they disagree with or what they're asking for. And more extreme action by unions is the boycott, and this isn't just the workers, but there is a public push for people to stop buying the particular products of a company that they believe is engaged in some type of unethical business practice. So basically, the unions have three activities that they can engage in. The employer also has activities they can engage in to try to get the employee to agree to a particular contract or to get them back to work. The first action is a lockout, and it's exactly what it sounds like, that the employer will not allow the employee to do their work. They basically shut the doors to them. We see lockouts most recently in the NHL, the MLB, the NBA, where the owners of the teams and the NBA itself locked out the employers the employees or the players until they agreed to the terms. Another strategy by an employer to be able to negotiate from a better position is to form their own company union. So this union isn't run directly by the workers, and instead it's organized and run by the employers. So they can stop essentially an outside union coming in and starting to organize their own employees for them. Historically, if we look at was our government favorable or unfavorable to unions, and what has the pattern been? What we find out is initially employers very much did not like unions, and neither did the court system, and the court tended to favor the employer over the employee and the union. Ways that this was done. The Sherman antitrust law, which if you remember was actually developed to be able to stop monopolies, will be used for purposes of stopping strikes and boycotts. You might remember reading about this in your book about the hat company who did this. But basically the government and the court systems use this idea of restraint of trade that was supposed to be applied to monopolies in order to tell unions that you cannot engage in a boycott or call for a boycott because that would restrain trade for that company. That was changed in the Clayton antitrust law, which we also studied in our monopoly chapter. And it basically said that the Sherman antitrust could not be used against labor unions. Its intention was never to be able to stop labor unions. So initially, the courts did not favor unions. That all changed around the time of the Great Depression, when workers were experiencing terrible unemployment, decline in wages. We started to see a shift, and we saw pro-union legislation around the time of the Great Depression. Some examples of that would be the Norris-LaGuardia Act. Within that act, it said that the unions did have a right to peacefully protest, and it forced companies to go back to the union and actually negotiate with the union for their contract or their working hours, and they didn't have to go into the court. It could be done directly with the union. Another piece of legislation, you probably did these next two in your US history classes, the National Labor Relations Act, or the NLRA, which is enforced by the NLRB, or the National Labor Relations Board. And it basically will give unions the right to collective bargain with their employer. We'll look at collective bargaining a little bit more in the next section. The next piece of legislation that was pro-union would be our Fair Labor Standards Act, and this is going to apply just to interstate trade. And what it does is it's going to establish a federal minimum wage, the amount of pay that must be given for overtime, and it will set regulations with regards to child labor. Those of you who work might have seen this in your workplace, and this is a reflection of the National Labor Relations Act. Since World War II, we've seen, again, the courts move against unions, and some of this is due to, if you go back to our US history class, post-World War II, during the Cold War, there was a time of the Red Scare where Americans feared communism. And if you remember anything about communism, it's a movement of the working class. So there was fear that communists were going to infiltrate the workers and the unions to try to stage some type of a communist revolt in the United States. So the court system swung back to being very anti-union again. So some of those pieces of legislation that reflect the anti-union movement would be the Taft-Hartley Act, and it allowed the employer to sue the unions if they felt that their contract was broken. It also made it so the union could not go on strike right away. There had to be 80 days where the employer and the employee would spend time, or the union with the employer spend time trying to negotiate a contract. It also made it illegal for a company to force workers to join a union to get a job. So you can't do that. You can't force any type of worker to join a union. Okay. The last thing in the chapter, if you remember reading, is the AFL-CIO, which is historically some of the most known unions, and now it is a single union. The AFL started in 1886. It was a craft union, so again, that would be skilled workers who all do the same thing come together. They later will add an industrial union, which again would be, I'll tends to be unskilled workers of lots of jobs. The problem is they didn't get along real well because these craft skilled workers had very different goals than our more unskilled industrial unions. So they ended up splitting again around 1937. And then in 1955, they decided to join up again. A lot of it was as the Congress of Industrial Organizations began to become more and more powerful. Their goals to be able to aid the employee started to come back together. All right, so that pretty much sums up for our section 1, the information you need. We'll come back and talk about the different ways that employers and unions work together. So hopefully that helped. Send me any questions if you have them. Talk to you soon.